Egypt is probably best known for its pyramids, or its pharaohs, or for its national font, Papyrus. Ancient Egypt has a long and vibrant history, and so it's no surprise that the history of music is long and vibrant as well. Today, we're going to look at that history of music as well as the culture that fostered it. Welcome to Music and History. Ancient Egyptian history is broken into three main parts. They're called the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, and the New Kingdom. Between each of these periods, you have three intermediate periods, and before that, you have what's known as the pre-dynastic period. We'll start there. Let's look at the timeline. Humans began settling along the Nile River around 6000 BC, and organized farming started around the same time. Unfortunately, no one wrote, "Dear Diary, I created Egypt today," so we don't know exactly when it started. So we have to skip all the way down to about 3400 BC, which is when the first written records appear. At this time, Egypt was divided into an upper kingdom and a lower kingdom, with the lower kingdom to the north and the upper kingdom to the south, because the Nile River flows north into the Mediterranean. Around 3150, these two kingdoms unified, creating the United Kingdom, and thus beginning the dynastic period. They named this kingdom the Old Kingdom, because it was older than the other kingdoms. You get it. This time was a great time of peace, prosperity, and advancement. Many building projects, including some of the pyramids, were built during this time. Thanks to this extended time of peace, the arts developed and flourished. Throughout the dynastic period, there's record of extravagant living from all social classes. All social classes enjoyed life. Life in Egypt was considered to be so perfect that the afterlife was A, just a continuation of life in Egypt, and B, only possible for those who had lived a good life in Egypt. So, the rest of us who are from not Egypt have nothing but not existing to look forward to. The nearly 4,000-year dynastic period was mostly peaceful and prosperous. Undoubtedly, this was a result of a stable civilization capable of excess food supply and security from internal and external threats. As such, Egyptians had the freedom to spend a lot of time on recreational activities. These activities included arts and festivals and music and reading literature and sports. And these sports included handball and archery and tug-of-war and swimming and something called water jousting. And if you think that I've not already sent the International Olympic Committee an email about adding water jousting, you are sorely mistaken. Religion was also a major factor in Egyptian life. The Egyptians had a full pantheon of gods that were responsible for controlling factors of everyday life, such as controlling the sun's movement, or bringing rain, or simply keeping two gods apart that didn't play nice with each other. The Egyptians believed that the gods were infinitely wise and had created the perfect social order, including placing the most wise and well-equipped among them on the throne as king. So movement between social classes wasn't really a thing. This religion also heavily featured magic, as this was the method by which the gods performed their duties. And since the gods controlled facets of everyday life, it was in the best interest of all Egyptians to keep them happy. And as we saw in the Sumerian civilization, many musicians were employed by the temple, and religious ceremonies that were centered around music were very common. The earliest musical records in Egypt show up around 2500 BC during the 4th dynasty, which came directly after the 3rd dynasty. Y'all see the pattern at this point, right? By this time, there was already a vibrant musical culture in Egypt, which suggests that music had been developing for centuries beforehand. Many of the pyramids from the Old Kingdom have depictions of music in them. By the 5th dynasty, about 100 years later, preference seems to be given to sacred music and the creation and performance thereof, although secular music was still in abundance. Sacred music appears to have remained fairly constant throughout the dynastic period, and it was given incredible weight. According to musicologist Geoffrey Pulver, at the religious ceremonies and processions where music was introduced, there is reason to believe that the attendance of ordinary performers was not permitted, but that musicians attached to the priestly order and organized for this special purpose were alone employed, who were considered to belong exclusively to the service of the temple. Much like Mesopotamia, there was a chief musician, whose title in Egypt was the Superintendent of Royal Music, which I think you'd agree is the title we'd all like to have. One account lists their job description as to daily rejoice the heart of the king with beautiful songs and fulfill every wish of the king by their beautiful singing. The 6th dynasty saw the government place less emphasis on art in general. According to many scholars, the art of the time greatly declined in quality. Wonder why. But I'm sure that all of the 22nd century BC Egyptian musicologists were bemoaning how much better music was 250 years ago and how fed up they were with current music. Anyway, about 1,000 years go by, and eventually the government gets weak and collapses, and it leads to a bunch of regionalized governments. They called this the First Intermediate Period. These regionalized governments eventually consolidated down to a strong power in the south and a strong power in the north. These two kingdoms were eventually unified by the king in Thebes in about 2040 BC. This started the Middle Kingdom, which was named because it was in the middle between the Old and New Kingdoms. Historians, look, sidebar for a second, maybe, I don't know, consider hiring people that are more creative to name your stuff? I don't know, just a thought. The Middle Kingdom was once again a time of peace and prosperity. This is known as Egypt's classical period, and is largely considered to be the heights of art and culture. Many of the great pyramids were built during this time, and this period also saw Egypt's first standing army. All of the armies before this had been seated armies. I'm sorry, I'll leave. The earliest physical instruments we have are from the 11th dynasty, dating to about 2000 BC. Invasions and immigration from other cultures led to a bit of a culture swap, which changed the course of Egyptian music history. As I said, the Middle Kingdom is often considered to be the height of Egyptian arts and music. One hymn from the time says, "Make thy day happy. Let there be songs with the music of the heart before thee. Let song and music be before thy face, and leave behind thee all evil cares." That says a lot about the role that music played in the everyday life for the Egyptians. Music was present at pretty much every social gathering, from royal banquets to small gatherings among friends. The empire had a huge community of professional musicians. The pharaoh maintained a royal orchestra which was often filled with members of the nobility, as music was not seen as something for the servant class, but something to be enjoyed by all classes. One picture in particular shows 8 musicians playing flutes, and they appear to be led by a conductor. However, rather than keeping time and giving overall musical interpretation like modern conductors do, this leader was probably giving the musicians hand signals for either pitch or harmony, like solmization. Think Guido. Love songs were very common, obviously, as were work songs from pretty much every profession. However, my personal favorite comes from the dudes that carry around royalty in chairs, talking about how much easier it is to carry the chair when someone's not in it. Of course, with this being the first record of a standing army, it's no surprise that military songs begin to show up, led by the trumpet and drums. It's also from this time that we start to see records of a large network of schools of music. Schools where people trained to be professional musicians, much like we would today. For example, the school in Memphis was considered to be one of the most prestigious and specialized in female vocals. Sorry, let's run that back one more time. There was a school of music in Memphis, Egypt, which specialized in training female vocalists in not jazz music. It's coming down the street. Okay. In addition to music, dance was incredibly important. As we see with a lot of ancient civilizations, music and dance were virtually inseparable. And, as it was with music, dance was enjoyed by pretty much all people. And while just about every instrument was used to accompany dance, the preferred method of keeping time was either tambourine or by clapping. Dance was used for all sorts of expression, however it's most commonly associated with religious ceremonies, with most depictions of dance being in a religious context. Of course, all good things must come to an end, and by about the 18th century BC, foreign powers, mostly from Asia, had taken over most of the Lower Kingdom, thus beginning the Second Intermediate Period. The Egyptians really did not want to welcome their new foreign overlords and largely unliked them. Unliked. I don't think unliked is the correct word. Whatever, I'm going with it. Even though these foreign leaders were unliked, they still did a lot of good for Egypt. They brought things from their own cultures, such as archery and horse and chariot, and crop rotation and ceramics. However, all of these advancements didn't keep the Upper Kingdom from wanting to drive them out. So they tried for about 100 years and were eventually successful in 1750 BC. The New Kingdom is probably what most of us think about when we think of ancient Egypt. In the New Kingdom, the king got a fancy new title, which was Pharaoh, and in fact, many of the pharaohs that we still know and study are from this time period. And once again, this was a great time of peace and prosperity. One article that I read went to great lengths to describe how beer production was at its height during this time, with doctors prescribing beer for over 200 ailments. That one really doesn't need a punchline, does it? While Egypt had always been known for luxurious living, this period really ramps that up. Ramses II was known for his great building projects, including elaborate public buildings such as the Great Baths. By the New Kingdom, there was a bit of a nationalist movement, for lack of a better term, which led to a so-called purification of the arts, as Egypt attempted to restore music to its former glory of the Old and Middle Kingdoms. And records from this time say that every occasion was marked with music, which I can only assume means that somewhere out there are Egyptian songs about going to the grocery store and filing your taxes and getting parking tickets. The New Kingdom also saw the height of the Theban school of music and dance, which had become a de facto royal school of music, and many of the instruments from this period still survive. However, in the 19th dynasty, music had once again declined. One commentator called the music under Ramses II clumsy, cheap, and careless, which it's never a good thing when your music is described like an Amazon review for an off-brand toaster oven. Of course, over time, the government weakened and the clergy became corrupt. It's almost like history repeats itself. This led to the Third Intermediate Period, which effectively ended the dynastic period after the 20th dynasty. After this, different empires had control of Egypt for virtually the next 2,000 years. First it was the Assyrians, and then the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans, the Byzantines, the Turks, and then the Ottomans, and then eventually the British in 1882. Okay, so I may have gotten a little ahead of myself there. We're just gonna reel that back in. From there on out, government-sponsored music declined, especially with greater antagonization from foreign powers, eventually leading to the Persian takeover in the 6th century BC. Folk music probably continued unaffected, as it often does. Even with all the gaps we have in our knowledge, one thing is very clear. The ancient Egyptians had perhaps the most advanced and complex music culture in the ancient world. This was fostered by an incredible period of 4,000 years of peace and prosperity, and by a government that valued arts and culture and music and general enjoyment of life. Music was being created and performed and enjoyed by all classes of people, and it permeated every aspect of everyday life. Thanks for watching this episode of Music and History. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. And if you like this video, please share it with your friends. Also be sure to follow @2MinuteMusic on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you're a musicologist who'd like to collaborate, please send me a direct message. I'd love to work with you. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.